Another thing that we had talked about yesterday, that I want to get Matt and Jerem's opinions on is the legal age of adulthood. And the way I described it was that we can have various things that in the future we can go over, like is there a legal age for drinking alcohol, a legal age of consent, and these different things. But to decide the legal age of adulthood, it would just be essentially the idea of at what age does it make sense for a human to in our society to be on their own. So if a parent kicks a kid out of their house, if they're this certain age, then the government would put them in some kind of foster care or whatever we happen to create. But if they're once they reach a certain number that we can call adulthood, then they'd essentially be on their own. And same thing where if a kid wanted to move out of their parents' house at a certain age, the parents could say like, "Oh, you're not allowed to," but at a certain age they wouldn't be able to because they're an adult. So in that sense of adulthood, Matt, what do you think the age of adulthood should be?
Well, I think it's a difficult one because I think the dichotomy's right. Like we have a different approach if someone's a child to whether they're a consenting adult. And I think that that should be a line that's drawn at the same spot, regardless of the issue. So if you're a consenting adult, you're a consenting adult, regardless of what the issue is, whether it's, like sex, drinking, legal contracts, all these things. And if you're not, if you're a vulnerable child or incompetent adult, because that's the other thing as well. Age isn't the only factor, so I'd have a hard time putting an actual age number on it. My personal opinion is that we have a kind of grey area in between what makes it like you got a child at one end and you've got an adult at the other end, and then you've kind of got this grey area of this age range where reasonable people can disagree. And I actually think if I think what we need to do is draw lines, like rather than having one line, I think we need to have two lines. So we have like a minimum line where no, they're definitely, a child below this age, and they're definitely an adult above this age. And again, still mental competency is also still a factor. And then within that grey area, I think the parents should decide. So the parents can release them
Mm.
from guardianship within that grey area, and say right now they're an adult and I don't have responsibility for them anymore and all the rest of it. But they can't do it outside of the grey area. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. It's almost like emancipation. I'm not sure how it is in the UK, but like if somebody is 16 or 17 and they want to be emancipated, they have to get the government to say, "Okay, you're officially emancipated because you've convinced us that you will be fine on your own." And then in our society, it could even be what you're saying, what you're proposing. I could send out to everybody, and it could be voted on. Is the idea that a parent could decide within a range, and so no matter what, if a parent says, "I don't want my kid to be an adult till they're 26," the parent doesn't get to choose that. There is a cutoff where no matter what, if you reach that age, you're an adult. But anything between that 16 and 18 or whatever number it is, then the parent and the government can have a say. That's interesting. I like that. Jerem, what do you think about that? And separate from that, what's your own stance on it?
I think I have a similar view, but slightly different. So I would say that like at 18, um, if the individual wants to move out, like has a good job and can afford rent, they should be able to. But I don't
Mm-hmm.
think the parents should be able to like force them to move out or like. So I kind of switch it. So I think it should be the choice um, of the person and not the parents.
Would
And
there
then I
be
think
a cutoff at all? Like if it was a 30-year-old kid that said, "I want to stay at my parents' house," like
yeah,
should they have to?
yeah. So 25 for me is sort of like the age of when you should be able to do things, so like buy alcohol or the age of consent.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
yeah. So 25 is kind of like the magic number, I guess.
Hmm.
For me.
Um,
Yeah.
I have a question about that, Jerome.
Yeah.
When you say like you're saying that the age of consent should be 25,
Yeah.
so would you say that like when you say that, do you mean kind of like completely, or do you mean like a tiered kind of system?
Ooh, can you give like an
A
example?
So like
26 and a 24-year-old having sex.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So I you could have Romeo and Juliet laws, right? So you could have
Yeah,
like a yeah.
because that's what I'm asking. Because I know in my state, we have the age of consent is 18, but we actually don't have Romeo and Juliet laws. So like technically, if like two 17-year-olds, have sex, like technically on the books they could be prosecuted for that, which I find kind of stupid.
Yeah.
I don't suspect that gets enforced very often practically, but there have been cases where you've had like consensual encounters between people of similar age range, and like they get prosecuted for it because there's no like Romeo and Juliet laws.
If they're both underage, who gets prosecuted?
What?
If they're both underage, who gets prosecuted?
I think they would both get prosecuted.
Oh, okay.
I think it's kind of like if a high schooler sends nude pictures, then if they send nude pictures of themselves, I think it's still considered like distributing porn. And then if somebody receives it, then receiving it is accessing porn. So it's like it's both, and it's probably in that same category. That's interesting.
Yeah, there have been cases of that as well, where that's another case where the law gets kind of stupid, because if you have like two 17-year-olds, like one sends nudes to the others, there's been cases where like the one who sends the nudes gets prosecuted for distribution of child pornography, which is, when you like write laws like outlawing like distribution of child pornography, like we would think that that's not really the intent of the law, to like prosecute people for things like that, but that's the result sometimes.
Yeah. So, Jerem, would you say that there should be the thing Matt was describing, where 25's the cutoff of anybody above 25 must be considered an adult, but if a parent wanted to allow their 17, 18, 19-year-old to move out if they truly wanted to, could that 17, 18, 19-year-old decide they want to be an adult at that point?
Yeah, well, so they could definitely. I think they should be able to move out. There may be some stipulations, like maybe the parent has to like allow it or something like that. But yeah, I think so. I mean, my issue is just I don't like the idea of parents being able to kick their 18-year-olds out of the house.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and I think that's a good range. For some reason, that's my go-to with with deciding what an adult is when can they be kicked out of their house. That might be a silly range to have, but I think I agree with Matt that once you're an adult, you're an adult. So like alcohol and cigarettes and joining the war shouldn't be at different ages. You just have adulthood and you do all the things. But if we are going to have things like you can start driving when you're 16, but you can't drink till you're 21 or whatever, that we're choosing an age for adulthood. I really think the idea of when one is not going to be protected by the government in like a foster care and also allowed to be kicked out of the house. So that's interesting. So yours becomes 25 at that point.
Yeah.
Phil, I'm going to do a quick recap on Matt's stance, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it. So he was saying that there should be a cutoff where at a certain point you're an adult no matter what. Like, so let's say it was 20. Anybody 20 and up, they're an adult. But if a parent and their own child decide that they think the child could be on their own, like a 17-year-old, if the parent allows them, essentially the parent can emancipate them for themselves. And then that 17-year-old can go live in the world as if they're an adult. What are your thoughts on that? I couldn't remember if yours was something like that.
Well, mine was, I don't necessarily see it as like everything is all at once age, right? So that's a little bit of a difference. I think that as I was listening, the subject was age of consent for sex. It was like Romeo and Juliet laws that were that were being brought up. So for me, I think the most elegant way to handle that would be like a quick formula. One formula I've heard someone else bring up is half of your age plus 7 years. That doesn't have to be the formula, but that can be an example of how you would determine Romeo and Juliet laws without saying, okay, if you're 18, your partner can be 16, but if you're 17, they can move down to 15. But if you're 16, it can't be 14 because that's not allowed. It has to stay at 15. It can get overly complex. But if you have a very simple formula, then Romeo and Juliet laws would be a lot easier.
Gotcha. Yeah. I don't. It does become interesting because like a 15-year-old with a 40-year-old, it seems to be a good bit different than a 16-year-old with a 40-year-old.
Mhm.
So, I don't know. I think there must need to be cutoffs at some point where we say this person's old enough, and anybody older than this age can do whatever they want with everybody else that is that age range. And then you can have an age where you say this is too young for any of these decisions, no matter what math you do. But yeah, the middle ground is kind of tricky, and that'll be interesting to figure out.
I just want to, like, the 25 sounds fine for, a 25-year-old can have sex with, a 90-year-old for all we care. They're 25 years old,
Yeah.
But on the other end, we're not really talking about criminality so much. Like if we're talking about a couple of 13-year-olds, it's like that's more of like a social worker issue where, we have to figure out why they're engaging in sex at like 12 or 13 or something disturbing like that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, yeah, because it becomes interesting because we're animals, and so puberty leads us to different things. So as soon as people want to have this act of sex, it's kind of interesting that we're intelligent enough to know that we want to protect certain people, but we can't stop them from doing it with people of their same age. I mean, we could, but yeah, it's interesting. So I think what we'll need to do is I'm going to send out a thing where everybody can just choose what they think the adult age should be. Whatever the average is of everybody's choice will become the adult age. And then at that point, fellow lawmakers can propose different laws that would counter that. So if they want to propose an idea of at what age a parent could emancipate their child, they can propose an age of, okay, well, this is the adult age, but can we have this be the consent age? Can we have this be the alcohol drinking age? And then we'll just propose new laws once we have an age in mind. Anybody have any other thoughts on how we should approach the age of our society?
Only just really to kind of flesh out a little bit my own idea that I've already sort of given. But this whole idea of, I really think that because I think just putting an age, I mean, even as someone else has mentioned, even age itself is not the only factor, because you have to like mental competency and stuff like that. And there's obviously times when we would not want to emancipate someone, even when they go well into the actual number age of adulthood. You know what I mean? So there's other issues outside of the number. But I also think the other issue with having two numbers, as I propose, rather than one, having like a minimum and a maximum, and then leaving this grey area in between that we say the parents can just decide the grey area, and we'll only enforce when they step outside of the grey area, because then at that point we can say, under this age, okay, it's definitely a child that you're abandoning or abusing or whatever, the scenario is implying. And if they're over a certain age, okay, this is definitely a consenting adult that you've got a free now to be able to make their own decisions. You're no longer the guardian. You no longer have the authority that you once had as their guardian and all the rest of it. And that grey area in between, the reason why I think that should be the domain of the parents is because every other facet, that is the case. Like if we look at something like child abuse, we will say, okay, well, there's certain things you can't do to your child because it's clear child abuse, and we'll step in and take your child away from you. But then there's this grey area in between perfect parenting and child abuse. There's this area that's like harder to define, where people might disagree with how you're parenting them, but they haven't stepped over that line of definitely violating their duty as a guardian and all the rest of it. So you can't step in and take their child from them, no matter how much you might disagree. And it's basically because they're the parent, they have that authority to dictate the grey area in all other aspects of their role as a guardian and their duty. Because the thing is, a parent has the duty of care over the child. You know, we're saying that if they abandon their child below the age, they could be guilty of like abandonment or whatever. I mean, I don't know what other laws are going to exist with regards to enforcing that in this society that we're talking about. But, you know, assuming that was the case, assuming we were going to treat them to this standard, well, then we're saying, okay, well, when we can say for certain that you're committing that crime, you know, that reasonable doubt that you need for criminal prosecution, when we can say beyond a reasonable doubt, yes, you're abandoning a child or you're raping a child or whatever the thing is because they can't consent, then it's below this age we can say for sure. And then above this age, we can say for certain, you know, in the other direction. But in the grey area, because by our own admission, we can't say for certain, and because it might not be an exact line, you know, as well, that's the other thing I think we have to accept, that there's not an exact line, you know, a day where someone just wakes up and they're an adult, you know. So there is this grey area. And I think because of that, I think we have to almost step back and say, well, the grey area is for the parents, and our duty is to set the minimum and the maximum and define where an actual violation is occurring.
Gotcha. Yeah, I really
Sorry if
like that.
complicates things.
No, that's great. I like that. And I think we should all propose different ideas. And so we'll figure out what we're going to call the adult age. And then the next set of things that we vote on, I'm going to add an element of essentially what you said of, do we want to pass that 3 years before whatever we call the adult age is the gray zone of parents getting to decide.